Today, in 2053, people all over the world live together in a peaceful and sustainable way. There is no war, no poverty, and no hunger, but a smart and green economy, serving the people and not just the investors. The climate change could be stopped. Air and oceans are being cleaned, and everyone is free to work and travel all over the world. How could this world change so quickly? Let's go on a journey and see what has happened since the 2020s. Enjoy the movie, and by the way, I am not a real person. I am an AI-generated avatar.
The world in the 2020s. The human race dominates planet Earth. Over 8 billion people are living in more than 4,000 cities on all continents, driving 1.3 billion cars. And for the first time in history, the internet connects the entire world, making any information available to anyone. Well, let's say almost any. Hard and dangerous work has been eliminated from most people's daily life. In fact, people start to get bored in their offices. Home electronics are cheap and transportation to almost every place is easy and accessible. But not everyone is in favor of the new technologies and economic growth. The world is divided into poor and rich regions, with approximately 1 billion people living in extreme poverty or hunger. On top of that, more than half of the world's nations are involved in more than 40 military conflicts, resulting in 50 to 100,000 deaths per year. Just one reason why millions of immigrants are moving around all over the world. And there is one more tiny problem looming in the distance. The climate is changing. Glaciers are melting, oceans are rising, and species are dying. Lots of plastic in the sea, oil on the beaches, smog in the air, and the worst of them all,
you can't find a fucking parking space in the city center.
But despite all this, most people were happy. So happy.
If you asked me like 30 years ago, climate, definitely climate. There was a time when I was sure that mankind will definitely wipe out itself by ruining this planet.
What was wrong? Oh my God, where should I begin? In the 2020s, there was a lot of war, a lot of crime, a lot of inequality, a lot of poverty and hunger. And the climate problem was extremely urgent, but still nobody took care.
In 1896, Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius concludes that industrial coal burning could affect the climate. In 1938, British engineer Guy Callender measures that both temperature and CO2 have already increased over the last century. In 1965, a U.S. Advisory Committee panel warned that the greenhouse effect is a matter of real concern. In 1988, during the Toronto Atmosphere Conference, 300 scientists and politicians came to the conclusion that we need to reduce emissions. And finally, in 2011, 97% of scientists confirmed that humans increase global warming. And with all that knowledge, guess what happened? Just from 2010 to 2020, over 1,000 coal power plants were planned, the number of flight passengers doubled, SUV sales increased fourfold, and Volkswagen cheated with phony exhaust measurements. Cruise ship market grew by 50%, and CO2 emissions went up year after year until 2020.
The point is, while industrial nations started to reduce emissions, other countries were growing and building hundreds of power plants and new industry at the same time, and of course having more cars and all that.
For our movement, the worst thing was the denial. Imagine, in 2020, the United States had a president who still denied any scientific facts about climate change.
If you drill holes into the planet you live on, and you pull out what's inside in order to burn it and release the fume into the atmosphere in which you breathe, I mean, that is obviously not the best idea.
The economic system at the beginning of the 21st century was clearly sick and out of control. Everything was built on debt. The financial sector made fourfold more revenue than the real economy. Again, this is important. Companies made 4 times more money with moving money than with real products and services.
Since the 1990s, the number of people living in absolute poverty had been steadily declining. But this trend changed during the COVID pandemic, when the number of poor people grew for the first time since 25 years. Interestingly, each time the global economy was facing a depression, the number of millionaires was still growing. So even in times of crisis, and when people needed support most urgently, apparently money was moving towards the rich and the gap between poor and rich widened. To measure the distribution of wealth in a country, the Gini index uses a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is an equal distribution and 100 is the absolute concentration of wealth. For most individual countries, this number was at an acceptable value between 30 and 50, but when applied to the whole world, the Gini index was at a value of 90%, because the people in some rich countries had 1,000-fold higher income than elsewhere. This also shows that at the beginning of the 21st century, people's opportunities in life were mostly a matter of birthplace.
Since the end of the 19th century, our life was based on an economic ideal of growth and competition. The competition has the ability to bring out innovation and the best price value, which is good. At the same time, this system has 2 major downsides. First of all, people love to save. As a result, there is a dumping price segment, with low-wage jobs, bad working conditions, low-quality, throwaway, and even harmful products. Secondly, if growth is your mantra, companies will always try to sell more and more. Now, if they use smart manipulative marketing, where do you end up? You create an economy which is not meant to satisfy demand, but create demand.
I always used to say, in capitalism, the consumer has the power, and that's correct. But only if consumers have proper information, they can make good purchase decisions. So you can say capitalism can give us the best results, but only if there's real transparency.
Of course, capitalism has always accelerated innovation and wealth, but the greed and competition have also caused a lot of damage, a lot of exploitation, and even wars. And I'm not talking about fighting for resources. I'm also talking about war as a huge industry itself.
Studies show that nations with democratic governments are less likely to start wars against each other. Since the beginning of the 20th century, more and more people were living under democratic governments. And after the Second World War, the global military death rate declined and reached a historical low point around the year 2000. But still, in the 21st century, it was wrong to believe that our world was a peaceful place. Wars were just fought in places where the Western society would not be disturbed. Just between 2000 and 2020, there were 80 military conflicts involving a number of 65 nations, which means that 1/3 of the world's countries were somehow involved in wars, not including one-sided violence and other military groups. Within the same 2 decades, the number of internationally displaced persons grew from around 5 million to over 50 million in less than 20 years. And only 1 out of 10 refugees actually arrived in Europe or North America. The huge majority remained either in other developing countries close to their home or got stuck on the route, sometimes facing horrible conditions and torture. Just on the way to Europe, more than 50,000 refugees have died, more than 2,000 because of illegal pushbacks and departure prevention by police or military. Even in the most peaceful times of human history, 50 to 100,000 people per year died as a result of war, and many more due to the side effects such as immigration, hunger, and bad medical care.
There are so many reasons for war: economic, geostrategic, religious, or just insane ideology, sometimes separatism. But in any event, we know that people who feel injustice or inequality are much more likely to fight. And for that reason, the best way to avoid war and crime is to create justice and equal opportunities.
If most people prefer peace, but governments keep fighting wars, what does that mean? Well, in simple words, the leaders are obviously not doing what the people want. And this is basically a problem of missing democracy.
Now, if you consider all these facts, Here is the actual master question. Why did humanity need so much time to change things? And looking back from today, we can say the biggest barrier was the separation of people into nations and competition and conflicts amongst those nations.
During the 20th century, new technology and communication accelerated globalization at such a high pace that global import and export grew by factor 50 in less than 1 century. The economic boost and modernization benefited many people, and the global relative poverty went down from 80% to less than 10%. While the economic globalization was accelerating, the cultural confluence was at a much slower pace, and the big global companies soon started to take advantage of that situation. For example, global enterprises could choose from a big variety of legal situations. Amongst many nations, they could find a place where the production is extremely cheap and then sell their stuff in rich countries at the highest possible price. They could do all the dirty stuff in countries with no regulations and could finally move their profits to a country where the taxes are low, or even zero. This era of cross-nation exploitation has made a few companies extremely rich, but at the same time created a lot of inequality, since the revenue was not split fairly amongst the whole chain of production. In fact, in many places, the big international players could use the desperate local politicians to negotiate special conditions.
Well, if companies compete, that's actually what we want. It's how the market works. But if companies make the nations compete, then you have a massive problem. And that was happening more and more since the late 20th century during globalization.
Logically speaking, it was clear that a single nation couldn't solve the big global issues alone. But around 2020, people were still identified with nationality. Maybe people didn't even speak any foreign language. And it was crucial for people to understand that they better start collaboration instead of competition.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm a primary school teacher from Athens, ambassador for the Atlas community, and I was the initiator of the World Peace Day project back in 2025.
I was maybe 7 or 8 when our teacher came up in the morning telling us that we'll shoot a little movie this week. I don't remember the details, but I remember how we were surprised when we saw our own video trending on the front pages of YouTube and TikTok.
In 2025, a young teacher from Athens started a media project with her second grade students that changed the world. She simply filmed the students' ideas about peace and a better world, and created a short movie which was then translated with subtitles in more than 25 languages.
Dear leaders of the nations, dear soldiers and freedom fighters all over the world, on our planet we have many conflicts and a lot of hate. And we know conflicts are not always simple, but what if we can have a break just for one day?
In honor of the United Nations Peace Day, the kids in the video ask people all over the world to do a one-day global ceasefire on September 21st, 2025. Born from a pretty naive idea, this video actually became a hit on YouTube and gained over 100 million views, just in the first 3 months.
So when the day came up, we absolutely didn't know what to expect. I mean, we knew that our video had been watched by more than 2 billion people, but we had no idea if that would be enough to have a real impact. So that day was extremely exciting.
I remember we were patrolling a small city in Syria that day, and it was quiet. Where normally you had shootings, it was just quiet. It was an incredible feeling, a mix of fear and happiness.
I just remember I saw our video in a news report on the local television, but actually I was too young to really understand the meaning of what we had done.
When we watched the media and the live cams, it was an incredible feeling. We also felt nervous because you follow all the media and of course you hope that nothing bad will happen. But yeah, finally I guess we were pretty successful.
The Peace Day project was more than just a one-day ceasefire. It also made people more aware of wars and suffering all around the globe and had in some areas a long-term impact. For example, in Mexico, people started to go out on the streets to protest against the drug wars and corruption. In many African countries, people used the chance to celebrate a peaceful day and started to organize future protests for peace and equality.
This video was maybe not a turning point, but more like a sneak preview of what is possible, what the internet can do, and what impact normal people can have.
Blockchain.
Blockchain is blockchain.
In 2009, the Bitcoin white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto started a revolution in the world of currencies and the internet itself. With use of the blockchain, a non-centralized encrypted database, money could suddenly work without banks and central banks. The new currency seemed so appealing that soon a lot of traders tried to make use of Bitcoin. Huge crypto brokers came up and enabled trading over centralized platforms, and just before Bitcoin could become a major currency, it ran into a highly uneven distribution, which today experts consider the #1 reasons why it finally failed and other currencies sustained. However, the blockchain concept has since become the core of nearly every digital currency and even more. The idea of a non-centralized and non-alternable sequence of data blocks became the foundation of many innovative internet applications, especially social and politically sensitive systems.
Hi, my name is Tiago. I'm a software developer and a political activist. I'm also the founder of Democracy.Earth project. I was born in Argentina in the 1980s, and I later moved to US to work on blockchain-based democratic systems.
I first saw Tiago in 2026 in an online conference of the Pan-European Party. And I remember I understood only 50% of his talk because it was about really nerdy stuff. But after his talk, I read a bit more about the concept, and I understood even more that this could be something revolutionary.
When I first got into blockchain technology, I knew that this much more than just some crypto coins. At the same time, politics in my country were really messy. And so we came up with this idea to make democracy better with software, with a decentralized social network for political participation, and we named it Democracy OS.
Traditional democratic systems usually had panels and think tanks to draft new law papers, which were then discussed in the parliament and either refined or taken into vote. What sounds simple was in fact an extremely bureaucratic process that often lacked transparency. That's why nowadays we use Web3 software to make these processes easy, secure, and transparent. Democracy OS was one of the pioneer projects in blockchain-based democratic systems, which are a standard today and which can be used in classic political systems such as direct democracy or in parliamental elections. On top of that, the software came up with tools for much more participation. For example, citizens could contribute or comment on law drafts, suggestions could be voted on, or delegates could be assigned to certain topics according to their expertise. But most importantly, the blockchain made all these things more trustworthy, secure, anonymous, and at the same time transparent and revisable. Any network node could countercheck any process without necessarily knowing details on every other node.
The first time we tried to make Democracy OS work was in 2013 in Argentina, where we ran for the elections with our own political party, and out of nothing, we got more than 1%, which was great, but as soon as we were into the game, we figured it out that you can't change nothing with a fair play in a corrupted system.
From our political work in Argentina, we could learn two important lessons. Firstly, it is incredibly hard to change a corrupted system from within. Secondly, if you want to establish something new, it is always a good idea to give people some kind of incentive, which should not be something abstract, but something real and tangible.
At the same time, a US-based investor offered us funding for our project. So we moved to Silicon Valley, and at this moment we also started working on a second project, a universal basic income based on Ethereum.
Also, when I learned about the UBI project based on crypto coins, I was fascinated. Because this was something that so many politicians had been talking about, but these guys, they just made it happen.
The basic income was very powerful in many aspects. Firstly, you could lift people up in poor regions so much by just giving them something like $1 a day, which is obviously not a lot for people in Western countries. Secondly, for this reason, the basic income was a very strong incentive to make people join our movement. And finally, we were heading into a highly automated tech age, so at some point the basic income was not a nice to have, but a must.
This is something I had learned from a video by Maya Gopal when she was talking about the European Union, and she said, the best way to unite people is to give them an incentive. For example, Bismarck united all of the states of Germany by offering all of the citizens social security.
At the same time I met Tiago, it was also the early state of the Atlas community, which was also extremely innovative at that time, with the idea of creating a new state, something like a future nation, but online, borderless and open for anyone. At this time, an absolute utopia.
The Atlas community was founded in 2021 to build a borderless worldwide community for democracy, equal rights, and sustainability. While Democracy.Earth was working on the technology aspects, the Atlas project became a fast-growing community with local chapters all over the world. The basic idea was simple, but extremely powerful and progressive at that time. Global change can only be achieved by a global movement, and not by many separate nations and groups serving only local interests. Since nations and governments were very hardened structures, the Atlas movement came up with a very different approach. Why not use the internet to build a new borderless state in which anyone around the world could just join? A new One Earth nation in which democracy and human rights are basic principles and where it doesn't matter where you are from.
With Democracy OS and the Red Party, we had tried to create a change from within the system in Argentina. But the Atlas community was totally different. In a world with hundreds of nations, suddenly there was a new global state next to them, where anyone can join online, and they were people respect each other, and it was definitely a huge idea.
You could say that the Atlas project was pretty much focused on building a community, while Tiago was working on the technology. And that, of course, was like the perfect fit. It was just a matter of time before they started working together.
So around 2026, we started to implement Democracy OS in the Atlas community, and that was such an exciting time. When we actually started working on drafts for Global Constitution, and it felt as though we could actually guide history.
The white paper for the first Atlas bill was meant to be really simple. Peace, basic supply like water, food and healthcare, equal rights, freedom of speech, and of course climate. And I remember, in the first version, we did not even include education, which hurt me a bit as a teacher.
Starting in 2027, a group of pioneers started working out the first set of global law papers, some of which are still applied today as part of the Atlas Charta. During the multi-step process, members could initially post ideas and suggestions, which were then ordered and consolidated. At the same time, people could upvote and comment on the suggested parts as well as attach documents and source links. Every draft could be challenged and challenges could be answered by the author and others, just like in a public support forum. Once finished, the drafts could go into a legal review and finally into a community poll to become confirmed and published as an official Atlas guideline.
The most difficult aspect of writing this draft was keeping it short and simple. because there were like thousands of ideas, but we wanted to include only the very basic of human rights. I mean, we knew that there was a human rights charter by the UN since 70 years, which was still not implemented in the nations. So we felt that at first, we need something so simple that anyone would agree.
Working on international laws is something totally different from national law writing. Instead of dealing with every single detail of everyday life, you start with the absolute basics called minimum consent, and then you go into a long step-by-step process to refine things.
I think it was in 2029 we finished work on our first acts and prepared to go into the final polls. And that night, of course, we went out for a drink, and I remember when Tiago said something like, well, now we have the tools to create a new world. Now we only need to reach out to the world.
A good friend once told me, what is a perfectly organized democracy worth if all the people are brainwashed?
I always believe that people in a democracy will make good decisions if they have open access to information. And this is a tricky point. How do you understand what is true, what is false, what do you consider objective or neutral information?
You are fake news.
That's fake news. Fake news. Fake news.
Yes, fake news.
At the beginning of the 21st century, modern democratic systems were increasingly confronted with a massive problem of misinformation. As the internet gave everyone the opportunity to publish information, the border between journalism and user-created content started to varnish. This insecurity about the credibility of information created a whole new branch, and thousands of so-called fact-checkers popped up to tell us what information was true and what was not. The creation of deep fakes, such as fake photos and videos, became increasingly difficult to detect, which turned any conflict into an informational war. While in the 1980s, computers could hardly do any graphics. In 2000, you could easily fake photos and documents, and since the year 2020, you could make any person say anything in a fake video. Governments soon started to set up research on fake detection, funded with huge budgets. But as we know today, a lot of history has been manipulated with deep fakes, from the start of wars to the election of presidents.
Do you want to know who's spreading the most fake news? It's pretty simple. It's the person who's blaming others of spreading fake news.
If you ask journalists and scientists, they will say real objectivity doesn't exist, because every selection and presentation of information done by a human is biased. Anyhow, what we can stick to is the minimum standard of evidence-based information, because this is something you can prove.
Trust is an interesting thing, because our willingness to trust not only depends on the information and on the sender, but also on the importance for our life. You may trust a taxi driver who looks a bit wasted, but you might not trust an airplane pilot who doesn't look perfectly competent. That's why people tend to believe fake news, especially about issues that do not directly affect them.
I remember I was talking with our team about these things during the Russian invasion, and this event and all the propaganda made us again realize that people in a democracy need independently sourced and trustworthy information.
And luckily, the blockchain did also provide solutions to make this work.
In the year 2018, an ambitious project called Civil.co started a journey with the goal to create a blockchain-based media platform for journalism. This platform should be owned by the community and follow a set of ethical standards to create more trust in newsrooms. Although the project did not succeed, the idea of blockchain-based news networks was later pursued by a few other projects such as BitPress, which was co-funded by the WordPress Foundation. Today, the field of news publishing is one of the most powerful use cases of blockchain. A journalist or a newsroom can become a verified node of the network and sign publications with a private key to prove its origin. Also, every post can have a timestamp and a GPS location. Once added to the blockchain, a publication cannot be modified anymore, but can be approved, challenged, and even quoted by other nodes. Over time, nodes with many approvals and reports can gain credibility. Nodes spreading false information may get banned or punished. Finally, the blockchain can be used to buy articles or donate to authors with micropayments, which makes collaboration and funding for independent journalists faster and easier.
At the time we started the Atlas Project, news and journalism were facing a huge problem because more and more people tended to consider any news media as fake or propaganda.
Blockchain-based journalism at that time was still in its early stages, but it gave me hope. It took a few more years, but in the 2020s, media networks and journalists began gradually moving over to the blockchain, especially after the propaganda during the Russian invasion.
I remember the very early adapters. I mean, in terms of big players, were Forbes. They started publishing on the Civil Network, and also Newspack, which started as a joint venture of WordPress and Google News.
For us, certified news and blockchain-based news changed everything because suddenly people had the chance to trace back any information to its source. This helped us to establish trust and a common knowledge base, which is essential for informed decision-making.
At some point around 2020, I talked to a professor from my hometown and I asked him, although we have all the tools to create a better future, why is there still no progress? And he said something like, for a revolution, you need not only a better system than the old one, but also the current system to collapse.
Stock markets around the world are facing another massive drop today, after the Chinese market was closed yesterday due to a general strike and never-seen-before protests in the capital Beijing, followed by massive police operations, thousands of arrests, and bloody fights on the streets. Our reporter Sam Brown is now on the line from Hong Kong. You spoke to people in Beijing today. Can you give us some details?
Hi James, yes indeed. Although the Chinese government is trying to cover this, colleagues here say that Beijing and other cities are facing massive strikes and protests on the streets, obviously induced by a video that's gone viral on TikTok and other social media. This video is basically calling people to conquer their country back from the CCP.
Can you say something about the origin?
The origin of the video is still unclear, but analysts say there must have been some kind of influential supporters or some kind of cyber attack to spread the video. Otherwise, it wouldn't have reached such broad audiences without being filtered by the CCP regime. In general, China has been facing a sequence of crucial moments in the last 2 years. The death of President Xi Jinping, the collapsing real estate market in 2030, and lately the international sanctions due to the military operations around Taiwan, which are also stagnating and costing billions of tax money. And even though citizens don't know details about the Taiwan War, they can definitely feel the economic impact, and this has created frustration.
Well, empires usually collapse either by inner problems such as economy or inner protests, or by losing wars. And for the CCP, you can say it was kind of a mix of both.
So, what you have to understand is that a dictator such as Xi Jinping is always grinding on the edge because leading a folk to economic success requires them to be highly educated. Smart people, of course, tend to have their own ideas, and that is always a threat to the centralized power.
2030 was a crazy year. Russia was still recovering from its economic breakdown, and the United States were suffering from extreme drought in the West and an unprecedented devastation from hurricanes in Florida. So you can say the Chinese crisis was the final straw.
After 40 years of constant growth, the Chinese economy suddenly fell into a crisis in 2030, as a result of the bursting real estate bubble with a rate of more than 30% payment defaults. Similar to the 2008 US crisis, the China housing bubble created a huge gap in the governmental household due to bank and loan savings. For a long time, the official Chinese economic data had been questioned. On top of that, China's zero COVID policy resulted in more healthcare costs and long-term economic problems.
Journalists assume the number of people are more than 10,000 today. The Chinese capital has not seen such big protests since the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989.
Shortly after Chinese markets broke down, other states also faced a significant GDP drop initiated by hysteric reactions of the stock markets. In 2031, the US unemployment rate exploded, causing more and more people to live on the streets. Similar things happened in Spain, France, and the rest of Europe.
It's 2031 and both the Occupy Wall Street and the 99% movement are back and bigger than ever before. Today we see huge protests in cooperation with unions, socialist parties, Fridays for Future, and many other NGOs taking place in all major financial cities across the world.
In the biggest protest action in human history, people formed a chain all around Manhattan and the city center of London to stand up for justice and climate, illustrating that this time, the top 1% will not get away that easily.
Around 2030, Western countries were already facing a chaotic situation. They had millions of climate refugees, resulting in protests and more climate terrorism.
Especially the US had massive climate disasters like the California mega flood, and now there was a huge financial depression that followed.
The 2030s were the most challenging and most crucial time for humanity in a long time. I mean, there had been other crises before, but this time we knew that somehow it'll be different. It was pretty clear that this time there'll be a fundamental change, not only cosmetic.
I always used to say, because nothing was really moving on, maybe mankind will need another crisis to make real change happen. And we should be happy that this was an economic crisis and not a nuclear war, or even worse.
One morning I woke up and I saw a text by Alex. Something like, we have a problem with our website. So I checked the server and I saw a massive increase of traffic in the sign up form. And then the next thing I saw was a screenshot Maria had sent it to me.
Hey everybody, this is the Tech Lead podcast and today we are talking about the latest Google Doodle.
Yes, exactly. You're seeing all these funny modifications that sometimes appear on the Google logo.
And today is September 15th, International Day of Democracy, so Google has decided to feature a very special project on their front page, which is called the Atlas Movement.
So how do we choose the Google Doodle? Well, that is a complex AI control process. No, actually, we do have an editorial team that makes a schedule and then works out the content for the doodle. And usually we do not go too deep into politics, but during that crisis. For the Democracy Day, we decided it is time to feature some progressive democracy project. And that's how Atlas came to the Google front page.
Well, to be featured in Google Doodle, that is probably the most powerful promotion that you can think of. And we had 2 million new members in one single day. That was insane.
From that moment, you can say everything went the fast track. We had so many new members every day and suddenly so many important contacts reaching out, from politicians to celebrities, business leaders, and of course, a lot of press.
You can say that blockchain-based democracy is like the holy grail for the political engineering. And that's why we decided this project needs some attention.
The promotional impact of the Google Doodle provided the Atlas community with a lot of publicity and an enormous moment of growth, allowing it to reach a couple of milestones in just 1 year. Also, many NGOs, such as Fridays for Future, started to officially support the project. The number of Atlas members first exploded in the financial centers of Europe and the United States, but soon also swept over to Russia and China, where people were seeking alternatives to the CCP. At the same time, the community started to grow in Central Africa and Latin America because the idea of a minimum human rights consent was very appealing for people living in places with high levels of corruption and violence. Also, the concept of universal basic income was added an option of sponsorship, which enabled people in the West to fund basic income to people in the Third World, a concept that was later extended to become the first international income tax. By the end of 2035, the Atlas community had 48 million members worldwide and almost 1 million people actively working on political processes, which soon brought up some new questions.
When you do global politics, you really have an amazing load of labor power. At the same time, it is super complex because you need to consider so many things and you have to manage all the people. So we created work groups for all the major issues such as environment, social security, taxation, and so on. And well, that worked out pretty good. So very soon, we had some solid papers on the most critical issues.
In the middle of the 2030s, many nations were suffering the crisis so much that the people were really craving for a real change. And you can say for the first time in the history, people were not only facing a global issue, they were also connected well enough to make the system change happen.
At some point around 2034, we needed to think about the relationship between the new Atlas state and the traditional nations because in some hotspots we had reached a critical number of members. Meaning in some countries, half of the population were Atlas members, which gave us a very powerful standing.
Since the early days of the Atlas community, a work group had been writing a general guideline that contained recommendations for national governments and how they could integrate proposals from the Atlas project within their political agenda. The idea of that paper was to create a smooth transition into a new era in which a global democracy could publish directives and nations are more or less challenged to do ratifications in their local laws, which is a similar process as seen in the European Federation. The reception of that guideline was of course very mixed and in some cases surprising. While a few governments were very open to the general idea, especially in Europe, some others received the idea with reservations. And of course a few governments did not even consider the concept or totally rejected the idea, at least in the first place. This was not always a good idea. For example, in Australia, where the Atlas community had an amazing number of 7 million members, the Conservative Parliament rejected any consideration of the Atlas General Guideline, which caused huge protests and finally made the government lose elections in 2040.
It was very interesting and exciting to watch how parliaments react in very different ways. But in general, everything went pretty good. I think we received local ratification in more than 20 countries in only 2 or 3 years.
For us, it was a very important process to, let's say, win over the nations to at least accept or consider the Atlas community as some kind of advisory instance. And one important, or let's say iconic moment on that journey was the moment of the first ratification.
Today is an important day for Greece and for the city of Athens. The place considered as the birthplace of democracy is once more on its way to making history because Greece may today become the world's first nation to pass a law paper proposed by the Global Atlas movement. Our Europe correspondent Susan is on the spot.
The so-called Atlas Charta contains a set of very basic ideas in the fields of climate, social standards, and education. Most of these are already reality here in Greece, but experts say that today's decision could be a very important symbolic act towards more international cooperation and could become a model for many other nations to follow up.
Αυτό
What Greece is voting today is not only an idea of better social standards, equality, and climate goals. What we are voting today is the idea of a global community, of global democracy, of politics made by the people. And I am excited that Greece can be a role model for that.
The topic will be number 6 on today's parliamental agenda, so we expect the polls and decision at around 2:30 p.m.
Wow, this day was chills. I mean, we were pretty confident that the ratification would pass, but anyhow, this was like a once-in-a-lifetime moment and of so much importance. And we actually met in Athens to be on site, and we arranged a small venue with a video stream and all that.
I think in all history, a session of a national parliament has never had so many live casts before. And for me, it was a very special honor because it was my hometown, the birthplace of democracy, and it was where we started the Peace Day project. So for that reason, of course, that was a super emotional day for sure.
I remember the moment where we were doing a live cast from Athens. Our venue was close to Monastiraki, which is a super noisy place in the middle of the city. But in that moment, when the pool took place, it was so quiet you could hear a butterfly.
I am right here in front of the Greek Parliament in Athens, and we are expecting the voting to start in a few seconds. We have heard a couple of very emotional speeches during the last 30 minutes. One of them, of course, by former Minister Yanis Varoufakis. He emphasised that today's decision can be an important roadside for... And we are now switching over to the parliamentary session.
We are now voting on the ratification of Law Draft 2035-216, implementation of the Atlas Charter latest edition as of the 4th of April 2035. Dear members of the Parliament, please make your vote now.
That moment was like incredible.
Even though we did not completely understand the meaning of the impact on that day, we were ecstatic. And I think for many people in the movement, this was a very important motivational moment.
Many people did not even realize what was happening on this day, because it looked more or less like the daily political boring stuff. But what happened this day was the beginning of a new era, the era of global democratic participation and global collaboration.
Soon after the ratification in Greece, more nations followed up, beginning with Iceland, Spain, and a few more European countries. 1 year later, the Atlas Project started a cooperation with the United Nations, which had a big impact for the standing of the Atlas movement amongst traditional politicians worldwide. Another important milestone was the ratification by China's freshly elected democratic government in 2038, followed by Russia and the US in 2039. Until 2050, a total of 73 nations had implemented the Atlas General Guideline. Simultaneously, the community continued to work and designed over 100 papers, which were published and increasingly adopted into national lawmaking.
What happened after Athens was super interesting. Suddenly, other governments wanted to become early adopters of Atlas as well, because there was a huge community behind it, and politicians suddenly saw a chance to profit from doing what the people wanted them to do.
In desperation to find a way out of the crisis, in 2037, the Atlas community suggested an international minimum capital tax of 1%. The new tax was rolled out in 2038 and applied to high fortunes defined as being 20 times more than the average. For the richest people, this single percent wasn't a big loss. But in total, additional $440 billion per year could now be used for climate, education, and healthcare, major aspects that had been neglected for a long time.
For many years, it was an open secret that a global standard for a wealth tax could solve many problems easily. With this 1% alone, we could pay for all public education and free public health care. It's embarrassing to think it took us until 2038 to finally make this happen.
Liberals and conservatives usually strictly rejected any kind of property-based tax. But property is the core aspect to consider in a world in which one person can own as much as 1 million other people together own. And looking back, the global wealth tax was probably the most impactful tool to create more global equality.
Just 2 years after the wealth tax, another breakthrough was achieved with the Global Poverty Fund, suggested and promoted by the Atlas movement in 2040, a project that started as a fundraising rally turned into an Atlas white paper and later into a political guideline.
If everyone around the world donated just 1% of their income,
200 million kids in Africa could go to school.
600 million starving people could be fed.
1.5 billion people could have clean water and a bathroom.
And everyone could have access to basic pharmaceuticals.
This is the impact that 1% can have.
Since 2040, every taxable person is meant to spend 1% of their income to a global welfare fund that is used for projects in the very poorest areas around the world. Some nations take this percent from their existing household. Others raise taxes by 1%. The usage of the funds has since been determined in a public global vote on a 2-year basis.
What people have to understand is that if you take 1% global income tax, you can raise $1 trillion per year. This means you will have around $120 to spend per person worldwide. And this is not a lot of money for someone in the US or Great Britain, but for a citizen for Somalia in 2020, this was a whole year's salary.
When the two tax acts were passed by the American and European governments, I felt for the first time in my life that democratic politics were actually working for the people. And this is how it should be.
One more huge achievement of the Atlas community was the Global Climate Act, which advised industry to turn carbon neutral until 2050 and 100% sustainable until 2065. Because of ongoing protests and increasing climate vandalism, most nations signed the agreement during a dedicated UN meeting in 2041. The new agreement extremely accelerated the decrease of global emissions. Since that time, climate goals have been mandatory, which means that countries and companies that fail are punished and sanctioned very strictly.
All these concepts and ideas that we already had since decades, like renewable energy, smart transportation, green cities, and sustainable agriculture. All of a sudden, we saw that all these things are totally possible and realistic.
The Atlas Climate Act was what we have always been fighting for. A binding and ambitious climate act made by the people, and not just another agreement of empty words.
I wish we would have signed the Climate Act 20 years earlier. Then we would have been able to avoid a lot of expensive decarb activity that we have to do now.
The implementation of Atlas guidelines has also made our world much more peaceful than ever before. The 2046 Nuclear Disarmament Act initialized a nuclear downgrading, including mutual inspections by a team of United Nations inspectors and strict economic sanctions for any states that would not cooperate. And finally, with the 2049 Military Transparency Act, more than 150 nations agreed to start a process of global military downgrade and transformation. former military units were transferred into an international police department with a standardized level of service quality to create more trust into police. In the same year, the community released an international anti-corruption guideline for public service employees and set up an independent authority to file complaints. All these things were important steps that led to one of the biggest international police operations against organized crime, which is today considered the end of the Mexican drug war.
All these things sound simple, almost naive. And indeed, they should have been done 50 or 100 years ago. But well, that's politics. Sometimes good things just need some time to become real.
The most amazing impact for me was seeing surveys in those countries that started to implement Atlas directives. People started to feel more trust in governments, even before those new laws became effective. And this is what happens when politicians actually do what people want them to do. No populist, short-sighted or selfish lobby-influenced politics, just smart decisions for the common good.
The most important thing that we have learned from the past 50 years, there is no such thing as a perfect system or democracy. What we have today is not perfect. There will always be change and progress. Freedom will always be something to fight for. And I hope there will always be people to do that.
My advice for people in the past would be work together. Instead of fighting, work together.
If you ask me why there has been so little progress, I would say it's because it took people so much time to understand that the division makes us weaker, not stronger.
Life is what we do while we try to